It's past midnight in Kansas City. A man is sitting in a parked car on a dark street, engine off, watching a light burn in a second-floor window across the road. He has been sitting there for 40 minutes. He is not nervous. Men like him stopped getting nervous a long time ago. In his coat pocket is an envelope. Inside that envelope is enough information to bring down one of the most powerful criminal organizations in the history of the American Midwest. He knows what that envelope means. He knows what happens to men who carry things like that. What has already happened to 2 other men who tried to do what he is about to do. He gets out of the car anyway, because tonight, something is finally going to change in this city. After decades of silence, after generations of looking the other way, after millions of dollars moved in the dark, from counting rooms in the Nevada desert back to the quiet streets of Missouri, tonight, someone is going to talk. The light in the window goes out. He crosses the street. And the story that started before he was born, in the speakeasies of the 1920s, in the back rooms of political clubs, in the carpeted vaults of Las Vegas casinos, is about to reach its turning point. But before we get to that moment, we have to go all the way back to the beginning. Before we go any further, drop a comment right now and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is wherever you are. I love knowing that someone in London is watching this at 2 a.m. and someone in Texas has it playing while they fall asleep, and someone in Australia is listening on a Sunday morning with their coffee. This community is something special, and you are part of it. If you're new here, welcome. This channel is your home for long form true crime stories. Hit that subscribe button, tap the like button, and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. It genuinely helps more than you know. All right, the fire is burning. The night is long, and the story is ready. Let's go back to the beginning to understand the Kansas City crime family. You first have to understand Kansas City itself, because this city shaped the mob just as much as the mob shaped the city. They grew up together, intertwined, feeding each other, and you cannot separate one from the other without losing the whole story. Kansas City sits at one of the most strategic crossroads in North America. It is the place where the Missouri River meets the Kansas River, where the eastern forests give way to the western plains, where the cattle trails coming up from Texas once met the railroad lines heading east. In the 19th century, Kansas City was a boomtown, raw, wild, ambitious, and absolutely overflowing with money. The stockyards and meatpacking plants drew workers from across the country and from across the ocean. Germans and Irish and Italians, and Poles and Czechs and African Americans all poured into this city, filling neighborhoods that grew up quickly and haphazardly. Pressed together in the shadow of the downtown skyline by the early 1900s, Kansas City had one of the most vibrant, chaotic, and corrupt civic cultures in the entire United States. And that is not an accident. It begins, as so many American stories do, with the question of who controls the money. In the early decades of the 20th century, Kansas City was dominated by a political machine so powerful, so all-encompassing, so deeply woven into the fabric of the city that it became almost synonymous with Kansas City itself. This was the Pendergast machine, named for its founder James Pendergast, and later run by his nephew Thomas Joseph Pendergast, known simply, universally, as Boss Tom. Thomas Pendergast was not a subtle man. He was large, broad-shouldered, physically imposing, with a handshake like a vice grip and eyes that missed nothing. He ran Kansas City the way a feudal lord might run his domain, with an eye toward absolute loyalty, generous rewards for those who served him, and swift, merciless punishment for those who crossed him. His headquarters was a Democratic Party office at 1908 Main Street, but his reach extended into every precinct house, every courthouse, every city department, every construction contract, every liquor license. every garbage collection route in Kansas City. Under Pendergast, Kansas City had a reputation. It was known as one of the wide open cities in America, a place where vice was not just tolerated but organized and protected. Gambling houses operated openly, prostitution flourished, liquor flowed freely, even when it was supposed to be illegal. The police, working under Pendergast's appointed commissioners, knew which establishments to protect and which to raid, and they carried out their instructions faithfully. For the Italian immigrant community that had settled primarily on the north side of the city, in neighborhoods around Independence Avenue and the surrounding streets, this political environment was not just useful, it was essential. These were families who had come from Sicily, from Calabria, from Naples, carrying with them old world traditions about loyalty and secrecy and the settling of disputes within the community rather than through outside authorities. They were, by and large, hard-working people, grocers and barbers and laborers and small businessmen. But among them, as among every immigrant community of that era, there were those who had other ambitions, other skills, other connections. And when Prohibition arrived in January of 1920, everything changed. The 18th Amendment to the Constitution, which prohibited the manufacture, sale, and transportation of intoxicating liquors, is one of the most consequential laws in American history, not because it worked, but because it failed so spectacularly and so profitably across the country. The demand for alcohol did not diminish by a single drop. What Prohibition did was remove the legitimate supply chain and hand the entire liquor trade over to criminals. In Kansas City, the bootlegging business exploded almost immediately. The city's geography made it ideal. It was a rail hub. Goods could come in from St. Louis, Chicago, Detroit, New York. It was surrounded by farmland. Corn mash could be distilled in 1,000 hidden stills across western Missouri and eastern Kansas. And it had a political machine that had already demonstrated in 100 different ways that it was perfectly willing to look the other way in exchange for the right considerations. The Italian community on the north side moved quickly. Among the first and most important figures to emerge from this world was a man named Joseph Scarface Di Giovanni. Di Giovanni was a Sicilian immigrant who had been involved in the Black Hand extortion rackets that preyed on Italian communities across America in the early decades of the century, the criminal predecessor to what would later become the formal mafia structure. He was tough, ruthless, and politically connected, and as Prohibition began, he positioned himself as a major player in the Kansas City bootlegging trade. But Di Giovanni was a transitional figure, important for what he represented, rather than for what he ultimately built. The real architect of the Kansas City Underworld, the man who gave it shape and discipline and power, was someone far more sophisticated. His name was John Lazia. John Lazia was born in 1897, the exact date disputed, in Kansas City. The son of Italian immigrants, he grew up on the north side, in the neighborhoods where Italian families clustered together for community and protection. And from an early age, he displayed a combination of intelligence, charm, and ambition that set him apart from his peers. As a young man, Lazia was convicted of highway robbery and served time in the Missouri State Penitentiary. That prison term might have destroyed a lesser man. For Lazia, it was an education. He came out of prison harder, more disciplined, more focused, and with a network of connections among the criminal underworld that would serve him well for the rest of his life. By the early 1920s, Lazia had established himself as the dominant figure in the North Side's criminal economy. He ran gambling operations, policy wheels, which were a form of numbers gambling enormously popular in urban neighborhoods, as well as more traditional card games and dice games. He was deeply involved in bootlegging, and crucially, he had cultivated a relationship with the Pendergast machine, that would prove to be one of the most important political alliances in Kansas City history. The arrangement between Lazia and Pendergast was elegant in its simplicity. Lazia would deliver the Italian community's votes to Pendergast candidates. He would keep order on the north side, mediating disputes, preventing the kind of violent chaos that would draw unwanted federal attention, ensuring that the criminal operations under his umbrella ran smoothly and quietly. In exchange, Pendergast would ensure police protection for Lazia's operations. Officers who might otherwise be inclined to raid a gambling house or arrest a bootlegger would receive quiet instructions to find something else to do. When Lazia or his associates ran into legal trouble, the right phone calls would be made to the right people. This was the foundational compact of organized crime in Kansas City, the marriage of political machine and criminal organization that would define the city's underworld for the next half-century and beyond. Lazia was not just a thug. He was a community figure on the north side, known to many as a benefactor. A man who would help a struggling family pay their rent, who would find a job for someone's son, who would intervene when a neighborhood kid was in trouble with the law. This was the classic pattern of mob patronage in American cities, the criminal organization as informal social welfare system, filling the gaps left by government and building loyalty in the community through acts of apparent generosity. The fact that the money behind those generous acts came from extortion and gambling and bootlegging was something that people found it easy not to think about. By the late 1920s, Lazia's power had grown to the point where he was effectively the co-ruler of Kansas City alongside Tom Pendergast. He controlled the Democratic Party apparatus on the north side with an iron hand. He had connections to organized crime figures in Chicago, New York, and Detroit. He was, in the terminology of the time, a boss, a man of power and respect in the national underworld. The national underworld was itself undergoing a transformation in these years. In 1931, in the aftermath of a series of violent conflicts between competing Italian-American criminal factions, most notably the bloody Castellamarese War in New York, a young Sicilian-American gangster named Salvatore Lucchini, better known as Lucky Luciano, engineered what amounted to a corporate reorganization of American organized crime, working with other forward-thinking criminals like Meyer Lansky, Frank Costello, and Vito Genovese. Luciano created a national commission, a governing board for the major Italian-American crime families across the country. The families would govern their own territories, but would resolve major disputes through the eye commission rather than through violence. Kansas City was recognized as a distinct family under this structure, with its own territory and its own voice in national affairs. John Lazia was its representative, but Lazia's reign would not last. On June 17, 1933, an event occurred that would shake Kansas City to its foundation and reverberate through the national underworld. It was an event that had nothing to do with organized crime directly, but that illustrated, in the most brutal possible way, the dangers of the world these men inhabited. On that morning, a crowd had gathered at Union Station in downtown Kansas City. Federal agents were transferring a federal prisoner, Frank "Jelly" Nash, a convicted bank robber, back to Leavenworth Penitentiary. As Nash and his escorts emerged from a vehicle in the station parking lot, a group of gunmen opened fire. When the smoke cleared, 4 law enforcement officers were dead, along with the prisoner they had been trying to protect. The Kansas City Massacre, as it became known, was a national sensation, front-page news across the country, a watershed moment in the history of American law enforcement that would lead directly to the expansion of J. Edgar Hoover's FBI and the federalization of certain crimes that had previously been handled only by state and local authorities. The connection to Lazia was indirect but real. The gunmen were associates of his, part of the broader criminal network he presided over. And while Lazia himself was not involved in planning or carrying out the massacre, the event brought an uncomfortable level of federal scrutiny to Kansas City's organized crime scene. Then, less than a year later, Lazia's world ended. On the night of July 10, 1934, exactly 1 year and 1 day after the Union Station massacre, John Lazia was shot multiple times as he returned to his apartment building at the Park Central Hotel. He was rushed to the hospital, but his wounds were mortal. He died early the next morning. He was 37 years old. His last words, spoken to his physician as he lay dying, were reportedly, "Doc, I don't understand it. I've been so good recently." It was a line that contained more dark poetry than the speaker probably intended. John Lazia was dead, but the organization he had built, the structure of power on the North Side, the relationship with the Pendergast machine, the connections to the national underworld, the tradition of discipline, politically connected organized crime, survived him. It survived because it was no longer dependent on any single man. It had become an institution. The question now was, who would fill the vacuum? The years following Lazia's death were years of transition and internal competition. Several figures moved to consolidate power in the Kansas City underworld, and the process was not always smooth. There were murders. There were alliances formed and broken. There was the ever-present competition between factions who wanted to move the organization in different directions. One of the men who emerged during this period was Charlie Carollo, a tough, capable criminal who had been a close associate of Lazia's, and who took on many of the operational responsibilities after Lazia's death. Carollo worked to maintain the relationships with the Pendergast machine and to keep the gambling and bootlegging operations running. He was a capable, if unspectacular, leader, and he held the organization together during a period when it might easily have fragmented. But Carollo's tenure was ultimately limited by his legal problems. He was convicted of income tax evasion and sentenced to prison in 1939. His departure left another vacuum, and then Tom Pendergast himself fell. In 1939, the great political boss, the man who had run Kansas City like his personal fief for decades, the man whose patronage had sustained organized crime in the city and whose corruption had made it flourish, was indicted for income tax evasion. He had accepted a $750,000 bribe from a group of insurance companies in exchange for influencing a state insurance settlement, and he had failed to report it to the IRS. He pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 15 months in federal prison. The fall of Tom Pendergast was the end of an era. It shook the political structure of Kansas City to its foundations. The machine he had built did not disappear entirely. Institutions of that kind rarely do, but it was permanently weakened, permanently tainted, permanently stripped of the brazen confidence that had made it so powerful. For the Kansas City underworld, Pendergast's fall was a significant blow. The political protection that had sheltered organized crime operations for 2 decades was suddenly uncertain. The friendly police commissioners and sympathetic prosecutors were gone or cowed. The organization would need to rebuild its political connections on a new foundation. More carefully, more subtly, it would need new leadership. And new leadership was coming. It was coming in the form of a man named Charles Binagio. Charles Binagio was a different kind of Kansas City crime boss than John Lazia had been. Where Lazia was charismatic and relatively beloved in his community, Binagio was harder, more openly political, more nakedly ambitious, where Lazia had maintained a careful balance between criminal power and community respect. Binagio tilted decisively toward political power, toward inserting himself into the machinery of Missouri, state politics in a way that would either make him the most powerful man in the state or destroy him entirely. He chose to try. Binagio was born in 1909 in Louisiana to Italian immigrant parents, but he grew up in Kansas City. where he came of age in the same North Side neighborhoods that had produced Lazia. He learned the business of organized crime from the ground up, the gambling operations, the bookmaking, the political connections, the careful cultivation of relationships with law enforcement and elected officials. He was smart, and he was energetic, and as the older generation of Kansas City crime figures aged or went to prison, Binagio moved aggressively to fill the space they left. By the late 1930s and into the 1940s, Binagio had established himself as the dominant political figure in the Kansas City underworld. He ran the 1st District Democratic Club, which served as his political base. And from that base, he operated a sprawling network of gambling houses and bookmaking operations that generated enormous revenue. But Binagio was not satisfied with running gambling and bookmaking. He wanted something bigger. He wanted something that no Kansas City mob boss had ever quite achieved: genuine, documented control over the political apparatus of the entire state of Missouri. His vehicle for this ambition was the 1948 Missouri gubernatorial election. In that election, Binagio threw the full weight of his organization, money, organization, voter mobilization, behind a candidate named Forrest Smith. Smith won the election and became governor of Missouri in January of 1949. According to what prosecutors and investigators would later piece together, Binagio had invested enormous sums of money in Smith's campaign with a very specific expectation in return that the new governor would install friendly men in key positions, particularly in the state highway patrol and in the gaming enforcement apparatus, in ways that would allow Binagio to open large-scale gambling operations across Missouri without interference. The deal, apparently, did not work out. Governor Smith, once in office, proved unwilling or unable to deliver what Binagio believed had been promised. The political protection that Binagio had purchased, or believed he had purchased, did not materialize in the way he had expected. The gambling operations he had planned to expand were not protected as he had anticipated. Binagio was furious, and word of his fury spread to the national underworld. The men on the commission, the national governing body of American organized crime, the men who represented the major families in New York, in Chicago, in Detroit, in Philadelphia, and Los Angeles, were watching Kansas City very carefully. They had their own interests in Missouri's political landscape, their own plans for gambling expansion in the Midwest, and Binagio had been, in a sense, spending their money on his political adventure. His failure to deliver was not just a personal embarrassment. It was a business problem. In early 1950, Binagio was called to a meeting in Chicago with the leaders of the Chicago outfit, the organization that had historically considered Kansas City within its sphere of influence. The meeting did not go well. Binagio returned to Kansas City under something close to a sentence. On the night of April 5, 1950, Charles Binagio and his close associate Charles Gargoda were found murdered in the 1st District Democratic Club, the very headquarters of Binagio's political operation. They had been shot at close range, execution style. Binagio's body was slumped in his chair behind his desk. Gargoda was on the floor nearby. The murders were never officially solved. No one was ever charged. No one was ever convicted. No one ever stood trial for the deaths of Charles Binagio and Charles Gargoda. But the murders sent a clear message. The Kansas City crime family, the organization that John Lazia had built, that Charlie Corralo had maintained, that Charles Binagio had tried to leverage into statewide political power, needed new leadership. Leadership that would be more disciplined, more focused, less inclined toward grandiose political adventures that embarrassed the national organization and drew federal attention. The murders of Binagio and Gargoda landed on the front pages of newspapers across the country. A Senate committee, the Kefauver Committee, which was conducting a broad investigation into organized crime across America, took particular interest in Kansas City. The city suddenly found itself under a national spotlight. Its mob connections exposed, its political machine further embarrassed. Its reputation as a wide-open city transformed from a selling point into a liability. In this moment of crisis, of exposure, of genuine danger, the Kansas City crime family needed someone who could hold it together without making headlines. Someone who could navigate the new reality, a post-Pendergast, post-Binagio reality in which the old forms of brazen political protection were no longer available. Someone sophisticated enough to maintain the organization's operations while keeping a much lower profile than his predecessors. They needed someone patient, someone precise, someone with a gift for silence. They found him in a quiet, watchful man who had been moving steadily through the organization for years, learning, observing, waiting. His name was Nicholas Civella, and the era that bore his name was about to begin. There is a particular kind of power that announces itself with whispers rather than shouts. And Nicholas Civella, Nick, to those who knew him, or Mr. Civella, to those who didn't quite know him well enough, embodied that kind of power completely. He was born on March 19, 1912, in Kansas City, Missouri, the son of Italian immigrants from the old country. Nicholas Civella entered the world in the North End's Italian enclave crowded tenements off Independence Avenue, where Sicilian and Calabrian families lived in tight-knit blocks. His father, Joseph, worked as a laborer and fruit peddler. His mother, Maria, kept house and raised 9 children. The neighborhood was alive with the sounds of hand organs, women calling from windows in dialect, and the clatter of streetcars. Young Nick grew up bilingual, devoutly Catholic, and acutely aware that power in Kansas City flowed through Tom Pendergast's machine and through the quiet men who supplied the cash and muscle to keep it running. He grew up on the north side, in the same neighborhoods that had shaped John Lazia and Charles Binagio and the generation of Kansas City criminals before him. He was one of several Civella siblings who would play roles in the family organization over the decades. His brother Carl, known as Corki, would become a central figure later in the story. What distinguished Nick Civella from the beginning was not physical strength or flashy charisma. He was a relatively slight man, careful in his dress, quiet in his manner, methodical in everything he did. He had an extraordinary capacity for patience, for waiting, watching, assessing, planning without revealing his plans, moving without announcing his movements, in a world full of men who talk too much. Nick Civella was remarkable for how little he said and how much he understood. He had been involved in the Kansas City Underworld since the 1930s, working his way through various positions, building relationships, earning trust. He was present, quietly, carefully present, through the Binagio years, watching the disaster of that overreach unfold with what must have been a mixture of concern and calculation. After the Binagio assassination, the Kansas City family was in a state of genuine crisis. The Kefauver hearings had aired live on television. Millions watched as Kansas City figures like Charles Binagio's associates invoked the Fifth. The Senate report named Kansas City a notorious center of organized crime. Local police launched raids. Mayor William Kemp promised a cleanup. Civella moved carefully. He kept operations low profile, paid off key detectives, and waited for the heat to fade. By 1952-53, he had consolidated enough support to be recognized as boss without ever publicly claiming the title. The Kefauver Committee hearings in 1950 and 1951 had dragged mob figures from across the country before. A Senate panel and, for the first time in American history, had put organized crime on national television. Millions of Americans watched as underworld figures invoked the Fifth Amendment and squirmed under questioning. The hearings created real political pressure for law enforcement action against the mob. In Kansas City, This meant that anyone who reached for the top spot in the organization was reaching for a position that came with an enormous amount of heat. The police were watching. The FBI was watching. The Kefauver committee staff was watching. Nick Civella took the position anyway, but he took it with an approach that his predecessors had not employed. He took it quietly. He made no public declarations, cultivated no newspaper stories, threw no parties. He simply, gradually, became the person that everyone in the organization looked to when decisions needed to be made. The transition was so subtle that even law enforcement was not entirely certain of the timing, not certain of exactly when Nick Civella became the boss, rather than just a powerful member of the organization. That uncertainty was entirely intentional. Through the 1950s and into the 1960s, Nick Civella built the Kansas City crime family into something more sophisticated and more durable than it had ever been. He did this through a combination of careful organization, disciplined management, and a series of strategic alliances with other crime families that gave Kansas City a voice in national underworld affairs far beyond what the city's size might have suggested it deserved. The organization under Civella was structured along the classic Cosa Nostra lines that had been formalized across America since Luciano's reorganization in the 1930s. There was the boss, Civella himself, below him, the underboss, who handled day-to-day operational matters. Then the consigliere, the counselor or advisor, who served as a kind of internal diplomat and strategic thinker. Below them, the capos captains, who each commanded a crew of soldiers and associates. The soldiers were the men who actually ran the street-level operations, the gambling, the loan sharking, the labor racketeering, the various business enterprises that generated revenue for the organization. In Kansas City, as in all American Cosa Nostra families, the actual number of made members, men who had been formally inducted into the organization through the traditional ceremony, was relatively small, perhaps 20 to 30 men at any given time. But surrounding these men was a much larger network of associates, non-Italians, men who had not been formally inducted, but who worked with the organization, relied on it for protection or business opportunities, and contributed to its revenue stream. The primary revenue sources in the Civella era, at least in the 1950s and 1960s, were what they had always been: gambling and loan sharking. Gambling, particularly bookmaking, and the numbers game was enormously profitable and relatively low risk if you had right political and law enforcement connections. Loan sharking, lending money at interest rates far above legal lenders charged, enforced through the implicit or explicit threat of violence, was another steady revenue generator. But Civella was also moving into labor racketeering in a serious way, exploiting his organization's relationships with certain labor unions to extract money from employers and to position his people inside union structures where they could direct pension fund, investments and other financial flows, and increasingly, his attention was turning to something far more lucrative than any of these traditional rackets. He was looking west, toward the desert, toward the lights. He was looking at Las Vegas. To understand why Las Vegas mattered so much to Kansas City crime family and to every other major organized crime family in America, you need to understand what Las Vegas actually was in the post-war years. Nevada had legalized gambling in 1931, but Las Vegas remained a relatively minor outpost until late 1940s and 1950s, when a series of major casino hotel projects transformed the dusty desert town into something genuinely spectacular. The Flamingo, built by Bugsy Siegel with money from the National Crime Syndicate, opened in 1946 and became the template for what Las Vegas would become. The Desert Inn, the Sands, the Sahara, the Riviera. Through the 1950s, the Strip filled up with enormous, glamorous hotel casinos that drew visitors from across the country and generated staggering amounts of cash. For organized crime, Las Vegas was something close to a miracle. The casino business was a cash business. Enormous quantities of physical currency flowed through these operations every single day. Money wagered at the tables, money played through the slot machines, money changing hands in 1,000 transactions every hour. And in the 1950s and into the 1960s, the regulatory environment in Nevada was considerably less rigorous than it would later become. The Nevada Gaming Commission existed, but it lacked the investigative resources and the political will to truly scrutinize casino ownership and operations. This created an opportunity. If an organized crime family could establish control over a Las Vegas casino through a friendly front man who held the official license, through investments from mob-connected sources, through the placement of trusted personnel in key operational positions, then that casino became, in essence, a printing press, not just for the legitimate profits that gambling generated, which were enormous in themselves, but for a practice that would become the defining financial crime of the Las Vegas mob era. They called it the skim, and nobody in America, nobody in the entire history of organized crime would become better at the skim than the Kansas City crime family. But we're getting ahead of ourselves, because before the skim, there was the slow, patient, careful work of positioning, of building the relationships and establishing the footholds that would eventually give Nick Civella and his successors the extraordinary leverage they would exercise over Las Vegas for decades. In the early 1960s, something happened that illustrated perfectly the status Nick Civella had achieved in the national underworld. In November 1957, the town of Appalachian, New York, became the setting for one of the most consequential moments in American organized crime history. A major convocation of mob bosses from across the country had been called, reportedly to discuss territory, the narcotics question, and the transition of power following the recent assassination of Albert Anastasia. The meeting was held at the estate of Joseph Joe the Barber, Barbara, a Sicilian-born mob figure in upstate New York. A New York State trooper named Edgar Crosswell had been keeping an eye on Barbara's estate for some time, suspicious of the unusual amount of activity around the property. On November 14, 1957, as the meeting convened, Crosswell set up roadblocks around the estate. What followed was chaos. More than 60 mob bosses and their associates fled through the woods and fields surrounding the estate. Many were captured and detained. The names that emerged from Appalachian read like a who's who of American organized crime. Bosses and underbosses from New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Illinois, Ohio, Florida, Texas, and elsewhere. Nick Civella's name was on the list. He had been present at Appalachian. He had been identified, questioned, and released. His presence at this national gathering of organized crime's leadership confirmed, definitively, that he was not merely a regional figure, but a member in full standing of the national Cosa Nostra, a boss who sat at the table where the decisions were made. The exposure was unwelcome, of course. It drew renewed FBI attention to Civella personally, and to the Kansas City organization more broadly. J. Edgar Hoover, who had famously and stubbornly denied for years that a national organized crime organization existed, was now forced to acknowledge the truth that his agents and state police had long known. The FBI launched a major intelligence gathering effort against organized crime across the country. But Nick Civella was not frightened. He was careful. He had spent his entire adult life cultivating the habit of caution. He understood that the way to survive in his world was not to avoid attention entirely. That was impossible for a man of his standing, but to give investigators as little as possible to work with, to conduct business in person rather than on the phone, to speak in oblique terms, to keep records sparse or non-existent, to operate through layers of intermediaries. Through the 1960s, and into the 1970s. As the FBI built its organized crime intelligence program, and as Congress passed new laws, including the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, better known as RICO, in 1970, Nick Civella continued to lead the Kansas City family. He managed conflicts with neighboring organizations, maintained and expanded his labor union connections, and steadily deepened the organization's involvement in Las Vegas. He was building something bigger than Kansas City, something that would make his city, small as it was by organized crime standards, a player in the biggest game of all. One of the most important relationships Nick Civella cultivated during these years was with the Chicago outfit, the powerful organized crime organization that dominated the Midwest from its Chicago base. The relationship between Kansas City and Chicago was complex and sometimes tense. Chicago, with its far larger membership and resources, tended to view Kansas City as a junior partner at best, and there were periodic disputes over jurisdiction and revenue sharing. But Civella understood that a close relationship with Chicago was essential. The outfit's Las Vegas foothold dated to the 1940s. Murray Humphreys and Gus Greenbaum ran the Flamingo after Siegel. Civella met Accardo and Giacana in neutral cities like Street, Louis. Agreeing on casino percentages, Chicago took majority skims from Stardust and Riviera. Kansas City got Fremont and Hacienda. Civella's no-drama reputation earned trust. He never challenged Chicago's dominance, ensuring steady revenue. Chicago had deeper Las Vegas connections than any other organization in the country. The outfit had been involved in Las Vegas since the early days of the Flamingo, and by the 1960s, Chicago figures were closely associated with several major strip casinos. For Kansas City to participate meaningfully in the Las Vegas bonanza, it needed Chicago's cooperation, or at least Chicago's acquiescence. Civella worked patiently and skillfully to develop this relationship, presenting Kansas City as a reliable, disciplined, low-drama partner. He cultivated personal relationships with Chicago leadership, with figures like Tony Accardo and Sam Giancana, and later Joey Aiuppa, and Jackie Chiron, built on mutual respect and clear understandings about who controlled what. He also maintained connections with the families in New York, with the Genovese family and the Gambino family in particular. These relationships gave Kansas City a voice in the National Commission's deliberations, and, more practically, access to the networks of influence and muscle that the New York families commanded. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, Nick Civella had transformed the Kansas City crime family from a wounded, exposed organization into something formidable. It was leaner than it had been in the Pendergast era. You couldn't run the whole city the way Boss Tom had run it, not in the age of federal investigation, but it was more sophisticated, more focused, more strategic, and it was about to pull off one of the most audacious financial crimes in American history. The desert air of Las Vegas is warm and dry even at midnight. The lights, millions of them, neon and incandescent, arranged in every possible color and configuration, turn the night sky above the Strip into something that resembles a perpetual sunrise. Inside the casinos, the air is climate-controlled, perpetually the same temperature, deliberately designed to make you forget the time and lose yourself in the world. The casinos have constructed a world of velvet and chrome, of ice-cold drinks and the warm sound of slot machines paying out, of felt-covered tables where the cards slide with a whisper and the chips click like tiny musical instruments. It is a world designed to separate you from your money. But there was a group of men operating from Kansas City and from Chicago and from Cleveland who had found a way to get the money before it ever reached the official ledger, before it could be taxed, before it could be traced, before it could be divided among stockholders or disclosed to the Nevada Gaming Commission. They called it the skim, and it was, in its way, a masterpiece of criminal engineering. To understand the skim, you need to understand how a casino's counting room worked. Every casino had a counting room, a secure, controlled space where the money from the tables and slot machines was brought at regular intervals to be counted and recorded. Currency from the drop boxes under each gaming table, coins from the slot machine hoppers, stacks of bills from the cashier's cages. It all came to the counting room, where casino employees would count it, record it in ledgers, and prepare it for the official reporting process. The counting room was the casino's most sensitive space. It was supposed to be highly secure, carefully monitored, accessible only to authorized personnel. The official records generated in the counting room were the basis for the casino's tax returns, its reports to Nevada gaming regulators, and its distributions to investors. What the skimming operation did was create a systematic mechanism for removing a portion of the cash before it reached the official count. Not all of it. That would have been too obvious, too dramatic. Just a piece, a significant piece, but a piece carefully calibrated to avoid raising immediate alarm in the casino's financial reports. The men who managed this process from inside the casino, the trusted insiders who had been placed in key positions precisely because they could be relied upon to participate in the scheme, would set aside packets of cash before counting began, or they would alter the count sheets, recording less than was actually present, or they would use a combination of techniques that made it difficult for any single audit to detect a pattern. The cash that was skimmed was then packaged and transported to Kansas City, Chicago, Cleveland, and Milwaukee, the four organized crime families that were, by the 1970s, the primary participants in the Las Vegas skimming operation. The scale of this operation was staggering. Federal investigators who eventually assembled the evidence later calculated that the skimming operation at its peak was generating millions of dollars per year. Some estimates suggest the total amount skimmed over the course of the operation ran into the tens of millions of dollars. Other analysts believe the true figure was considerably higher. The nature of the crime, the whole point of which was to leave no paper trail, makes precision impossible. The Kansas City crime family's primary foothold in Las Vegas was through the Stardust Hotel and Casino. The Stardust was one of the most famous casinos on the Las Vegas Strip, a sprawling property known for its enormous neon sign, its showroom entertainment, and its enormous gambling floor. It had opened in 1958 and had quickly become one of the most visited properties on the Strip. Behind the Stardust's glamorous facade, however, was a complicated ownership and management structure that reflected the mob's careful approach to maintaining influence while avoiding official detection. The casino was nominally under the management of an organization called the Argent Corporation, which was controlled by a Chicago man named Alan Glick. Glick was a young real estate developer from Pittsburgh who had obtained enormous loans from the Teamsters Union's Central States Pension Fund, a fund that the Chicago and Kansas City mobs had enormous influence over, to purchase the Stardust and other Las Vegas properties. Glick, from the mob's perspective, was a front, a technically legitimate businessman who could hold casino licenses and interact with regulators while the real power over the casinos. Operations rested with the mob figures who had arranged his financing and who expected their investment, with significant interest, to be repaid. The day-to-day operational management of the Stardust was handled by a Chicago mob associate named Frank Lefty Rosenthal. Rosenthal was a gifted gambling figure. He understood the casino business with an almost scientific precision, and he had been placed in the Stardust to ensure that the mob's interests were protected and that the skimming operation was run efficiently. Nick Civella and the Kansas City organization were partners in this arrangement. They received a share of the skim in proportion to their contribution to the Teamsters Pension Fund loans and their overall participation in the structure. The money came to Kansas City through couriers, trusted men who transported the cash physically, sometimes in suitcases, sometimes in other containers, across the desert and through the plains to Missouri. The Fremont Hotel and Casino in downtown Las Vegas was another property with significant Kansas City connections. And the Hacienda, on the southern end of the Strip, was also part of the broader network of mob-influenced properties. Together, these properties formed a financial system that was, for a period of years, generating extraordinary returns for the Kansas City crime family and its partners. Let us pause here, in the middle of the Nevada desert night, and think about what this arrangement actually meant. In Kansas City, Nick Civella was running a relatively modest criminal organization by the standards of the major East Coast families. He had perhaps 20 or 30 made members, a few hundred associates, and a territory that, while strategically located, lacked the population density of New York or Chicago. The traditional revenue streams of gambling and loan sharking were profitable, but they were not spectacular. Las Vegas changed everything. The skim money that flowed back to Kansas City elevated the organization to a financial level that its local operations alone could never have supported. It allowed Civella to maintain a lifestyle and to maintain the organization's operational capacity that was entirely disproportionate to what might have been expected from a mid-sized Midwestern city. More importantly, it gave Kansas City real leverage in the national underworld. The ability to access Teamsters pension fund capital, which Chicago and Kansas City controlled jointly, through their dominance of the Central States Pension Fund, made them indispensable partners for anyone who needed large-scale financing for real estate or other capital-intensive projects. This was power of a very real and practical kind. You didn't need to threaten people when you controlled whether their application for a $100 million loan would be approved. Nick Civella understood all of this with complete clarity. He had spent years building the relationships and establishing the footholds that made the Las Vegas operation possible. He was justifiably proud of what he had created. But there was a shadow growing over Las Vegas, and over Kansas City, and over everything he had built. The FBI was watching. The Federal Bureau of Investigation's pursuit of organized crime had accelerated dramatically after the Appalachian debacle of 1957. J. Edgar Hoover, no longer able to deny the existence of the National Crime Organization, had launched the Top Hoodlum program, which directed each field office to identify and investigate the major organized crime figures in its territory. Kansas City was among the cities targeted through the 1960s. FBI agents in Kansas City and Las Vegas had been building files on the mob's casino connections, gathering intelligence, interviewing sources, attempting to understand the financial mechanisms through which organized crime extracted money from Las Vegas's gambling operations. By the early 1970s, as the RICO statute came into effect, and as the FBI's organized crime investigations grew more sophisticated, the evidence was building, but building a prosecutable case was enormously difficult. The skim operation was specifically designed to be invisible. No records, no paper trail, no witnesses willing to testify. The layers of intermediaries between the mob bosses in Kansas City and the money flowing from the casino counting rooms were carefully maintained, precisely to prevent any single investigator from seeing the whole picture. But then, in the mid-1970s, the FBI caught a break. The nature of that break and the extraordinary investigation it launched would prove to be the beginning of the end for Nick Civella, for the Kansas City crime family, and for the entire network of mob influence over Las Vegas that he had spent decades constructing. The investigation that would eventually bring it all down was called Operation Strawman. Operation Strawman was one of the most complex and long-running organized crime investigations in FBI history. It began in the mid-1970s and would not reach its conclusion until the mid-1980s. It involved FBI field offices in Las Vegas, Kansas City, Chicago, Cleveland, and Milwaukee. It employed an array of investigative techniques: physical surveillance, financial analysis, informants, and eventually, electronic surveillance that together built a picture of the skimming operation, so detailed and so well documented that it would eventually produce convictions against virtually the entire leadership of 4 organized crime families. The Kansas City field office, working under Supervisor James Nelson and later under other agents, who would become legendary figures in the history of organized crime investigation, slowly and patiently assembled the pieces. They identified the couriers who transported the skim money. They traced the financial records that connected Alan Glick's casino loans to the Teamsters Central States Pension Fund and the pension fund to mob-connected figures in Chicago and Kansas City. They followed the money, but the most crucial tool, the one that would ultimately prove decisive, was electronic surveillance. In 1978 and 1979, FBI agents, working with court-authorized warrants, installed listening devices in locations where they believed Nick Civella and his associates were conducting business. What they recorded changed everything. The recordings, hours and hours of them, gathered over weeks and months, captured conversations that documented the Las Vegas operation with a precision that no physical evidence alone could have provided. They captured discussions of the skim money. They captured conversations about the relative shares going to Kansas City, Chicago, Cleveland, and Milwaukee. They captured arguments about personnel and operations at the casino properties. They captured names, amounts, arrangements, all discussed in the kind of frank, specific terms that men use when they believe they are speaking in private. Among the most significant recordings were those made at the home of Nick Civella's brother, Carl Corki Civella. The FBI had obtained authorization to place a listening device in the Civella family's home environment, and the conversations captured there were devastating, not just for what they revealed about the Las Vegas operation, but for what they revealed about the internal workings of the Kansas City family itself. Nick Civella, who had spent decades maintaining his carefully cultivated silence and discretion, was now being heard. The recordings documented his role as boss with unmistakable clarity. They showed him directing the organization's activities, discussing strategy, resolving disputes. They showed the relationship between Kansas City and Chicago in operational detail. They showed the mechanics of the skim. The evidence was building. The walls were beginning to close. But Nick Civella was still free, and he was still fighting. There is a particular quality to the feeling of being watched that experienced criminals develop a kind of sixth sense for. They notice the car that parks on their street 2 days in a row. They notice the telephone repair van that seems to have been on their block for an unusually long time. They notice the slight change in the quality of the background noise on a phone call, the faint, almost imperceptible electronic signature that surveillance equipment sometimes introduced in those years. Nick Civella was not unaware that the FBI was watching him. By the late 1970s, he had been a target of federal scrutiny for over 2 decades. He had been identified at Appalachian. He had been the subject of intelligence reports and surveillance operations going back to the early 1960s. He had managed, through extraordinary caution and the meticulous maintenance of distance between himself and the organization's street-level activities, to avoid prosecution for a remarkably long time. But the combination of forces now arrayed against him was unlike anything he had faced before. The RICO statute, the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, had changed the legal landscape in a fundamental way. Before RICO, prosecutors had been required to prove specific criminal acts committed by specific individuals. This was enormously difficult in organized crime cases. where the structure of the organization was specifically designed to isolate the leaders from the actual commission of crimes. RICO changed the standard. Under RICO, it was sufficient to prove that a defendant had participated in a pattern of racketeering, activity in connection with an ongoing criminal enterprise. The boss didn't need to have personally committed the crime. He just needed to have directed or benefited from an organization that did. This was the legal weapon that would eventually bring down organized crime leaders across the country. But it required evidence. Evidence of the pattern of racketeering, evidence of the enterprise, evidence of the relationships and communications and decisions that connected the boss to the organization's criminal activities. The electronic surveillance recordings were exactly that evidence. The FBI's wiretap operations in Kansas City in the late 1970s were conducted with extraordinary care. The agents involved understood that any procedural mistake could invalidate the recordings and blow the prosecution. They obtained proper court authorization for each surveillance installation, documented their work meticulously, and handled the recordings in ways designed to ensure their admissibility at trial. What they captured over the months of surveillance was a comprehensive picture of the Kansas City organization's leadership and activities. They captured Nick Civella himself in conversations that documented his role as boss beyond any reasonable doubt. They captured his brother Carl Corki Civella, who served as an important operational figure in the organization. They captured conversations with Chicago figures, with Las Vegas personnel, with local operatives. They captured conversations about murder. In one of the most chilling aspects of the surveillance, agents recorded discussions about potential acts of violence, the kind of frank, businesslike discussions about eliminating problems that revealed, more starkly than perhaps anything else could, the nature of the organization they were investigating. The recordings also captured something unexpected, and for the prosecution, extraordinarily valuable, moments of candor in which participants in the Las Vegas skimming operation discussed the mechanics of the scheme in remarkable detail. How much was being skimmed, how it was being packaged and transported, who was getting what share, what problems existed at the various casino properties, what needed to be done to maintain and protect the operation. The agents working Operation Strawman cross-referenced the Kansas City surveillance with parallel surveillance in Chicago and Las Vegas. The picture that emerged was of a coordinated, multi-city criminal enterprise operating with considerable sophistication and enormous financial impact. By 1981, the investigation had reached the point where prosecution decisions needed to be made. The evidence was strong. The question was how to sequence the indictments for maximum impact. In April of 1983, Nick Civella appeared in a federal courtroom in Kansas City. He was 70 years old, and he was dying. Civella had been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, and by the time the federal prosecution of the skimming operation came to a head, he was a visibly ill man. The energy and precision that had characterized him throughout his long career as boss was still visible in his eyes, in the watchful, assessing quality of his gaze, the careful way he chose his words even in the most difficult circumstances. But the physical toll of his illness was unmistakable. He had already been convicted in 1980 on charges related to the Las Vegas skimming operation. He had been sentenced to 4 years in prison. He was released in 1982 due to his declining health. And then, in the spring of 1983, in the midst of further legal proceedings stemming from the Operation Strawman investigation, Nick Civella, the man who had run the Kansas City crime family for over 3 decades, who had elevated a mid-sized Midwestern city to a position of genuine national power in the underworld, who had built the Las Vegas connection that made his organization, a player in the biggest financial scheme organized crime had ever engineered, died. He died on March 12, 1983, in Kansas City, Missouri. He was 70 years old. He died in his own bed, which for a man in his position was In a dark way, something of an achievement. His death marked the end of an era, not just because he was gone, but because of what he left behind, or more precisely, what he was leaving his organization to face without him. The federal prosecution of Operation Strawman was not over. It was barely beginning in the coming years. That prosecution would work through every level of the Kansas City organization. From the top down, it would produce conviction after conviction. Sentence after sentence, it would strip the organization of its leadership, its Las Vegas connections, and ultimately its operational capacity. Nick Civella had built something remarkable, but he had not built it to last forever. And now, without him, it was about to encounter forces that would test it beyond its capacity to endure. Let us talk about some of the other men who inhabited this world, the lieutenants and operatives and strategists who made the organization function during the Civella era, whose names are less famous than Nick's, but whose contributions to the story are essential. Carl DeLuna was one of the most important figures in the Kansas City organization's Las Vegas operation, known variously as Tuffy and by other nicknames. DeLuna served as a key liaison between the Kansas City family and the casino operations in Las Vegas. He was deeply involved in the practical mechanics of the skimming operation, the coordination of the counting room procedures, the packaging and transportation of the skim money. The FBI surveillance captured him in conversations that were among the most damning in the entire investigation. DeLuna was a Kansas City native, born in 1931, who had grown up in the organization and worked his way into a position of significant operational responsibility. He was not a public figure in the way that some mob figures became. He did not seek notoriety, did not have the kind of flamboyant personality that drew attention. He was, in the parlance of the Underworld, a worker, a man who got things done efficiently and quietly. His efficiency would eventually lead to his undoing. The FBI surveillance captured him in enough detail to make him one of the central defendants in the Operation Strawman prosecution. Peter Tamburello was another significant figure in the Kansas City organization during the Civella years. He occupied a position in the organization's structure that made him an important intermediary in various business dealings. And his name appears in the surveillance records and investigative files in ways that illustrate the web of relationships through which the organization operated. Joe LaSala was among the figures who helped manage the organization's traditional Kansas City operations, the gambling and bookmaking enterprises that had been the foundation of the family's revenue since the Lazia days. In a world increasingly focused on the Las Vegas opportunity, men like LaSala maintained the organizational infrastructure on the home ground, the relationships with local law enforcement, the management of the crews who ran the street-level gambling operations, the day-to-day administration of the organization's finances. These men, DeLuna, Tamburello, LaSala, and others like them, were the connective tissue of the Kansas City crime family. They were the ones who translated Nick Civella's strategic vision into operational reality. They were the ones who showed up every day, made the decisions that kept things running, handled the problems that arose in any complex organization. They were also, ultimately, the ones who would be arrested, prosecuted, and imprisoned as Operation Strawman moved through its prosecution phase. The period from 1981 to 1986 was a time of cascading legal disaster for the Kansas City crime family. In 1983, even before Nick Civella's death, federal grand juries were returning indictments against members of the organization at a pace that had never before been seen in Kansas City. The charges ranged from the Las Vegas skimming counts to various forms of wire fraud, tax evasion, and conspiracy. Each indictment required legal resources, expensive, specialized defense attorneys, and created pressure on the individuals charged to consider cooperation with prosecutors. The specter of cooperation, of someone in the organization deciding that their own freedom was worth more than their loyalty to their colleagues, hung over the entire prosecution phase. The FBI and the Justice Department's organized crime strike force were well aware that a single cooperating witness from inside the organization could corroborate the surveillance recordings and fill in the gaps in the evidentiary picture. And the defendants knew it too. This created a particular kind of tension, the paranoid, suffocating atmosphere of an organization whose members are all watching each other for signs of weakness, all wondering whether the man sitting next to them in the defense attorney's waiting room might be making a different calculation, all aware that the surveillance recordings meant that the government already knew more than anyone was comfortable with. It was in this atmosphere that Carl Corki Civella, Nick's brother, the man who had been at the center of the family's operations for decades and whose home had been the site of some of the FBI's most productive surveillance, stepped into the leadership role that his brother's death had left vacant. He inherited a kingdom that was already burning. Carl Corki Civella was not his brother Nick, where Nick had possessed a quality of still, controlled authority, a natural leadership presence that made men listen to him and follow him without the need for displays of force. Corki was more volatile, more visibly emotional, more reactive. He had spent decades in the shadow of his more talented brother, filling important operational roles, but never quite being the strategic thinker, the long-game player, the man who held the vision of what the organization was and where it was going. He was, by the early 1980s, in his mid-60s, an old man by the standards of the criminal life, a man who had survived decades of dangerous existence through a combination of loyalty to his brother, personal toughness, and the good fortune of being adjacent to power rather than holding it himself. He had been a target of the FBI surveillance, and he knew it. He had seen the organization's finances disrupted by the legal proceedings. He had watched as colleagues and subordinates were indicted, one after another, in the relentless progression of Operation Strawman. And now he was in charge, the position of boss of the Kansas City crime family. In the mid-1980s was perhaps the most dangerous job in American organized crime. Not physically dangerous in the traditional sense. The era of mob wars was largely over, and the Chicago and Kansas City organizations were not in the business of killing each other. The danger was legal. The danger was the federal government, the FBI, the strike force prosecutors, who had spent years building their cases, and who were now, with the evidence in hand and the indictments returned, systematically working through the organization from bottom to top. Corki Civella knew he was in danger. He also knew that the organization needed him, or needed someone, to hold things together, to maintain some semblance of order and leadership in a moment of genuine crisis. He tried, even that, he tried. But the forces arrayed against him were not going to be managed or negotiated or waited out. In September of 1983, the first major Strawman indictments came down in Kansas City. Among those charged were Carl DeLuna, Joe LaSala, and a number of other key figures in the organization's Las Vegas operation. The charges detailed the skimming scheme at the Stardust, the transportation of the skim money to Kansas City, and the broader conspiracy involving Chicago, Cleveland, and Milwaukee. The defendants hired lawyers. The lawyers examined the evidence, and the lawyers told their clients what any honest defense attorney who had seen the FBI surveillance recordings would have to tell them. The government had an extraordinarily strong case. The trial, known to history as the Strawman I trial, took place in Kansas City in 1984 and 1985. It lasted months. The prosecution presented the surveillance recordings, the financial records, the testimony of cooperating witnesses. The defense did what it could, challenging the surveillance authorizations, attacking the witnesses' credibility, arguing that the recordings were ambiguous or had been taken out of context. The jury convicted DeLuna, LaSala, and their co-defendants were found guilty on multiple counts of racketeering, conspiracy, and related charges. Sentences ranged from several years to over a decade. The convictions were a body blow to the organization, but the government was not done. Operation Strawman had produced not one indictment, but 2 phases of prosecution. The second phase, Strawman II, would reach even higher into the organizational leadership. Corki Civella himself was indicted in the second round of prosecutions. The charges against him related to his role in the overall conspiracy, his participation in discussions about the Las Vegas operation, his presence in the leadership of an organization engaged in the racketeering scheme. His trial was a brutal experience. The government played the surveillance recordings, captured in and around his home, recordings in which he and other family members had discussed the organization's business with the kind of candor that men use in their own kitchens. Recordings that stripped away the protective layers of distance and deniability that mob bosses rely on. Corki Civella was convicted. He was sentenced to prison. Given his age and his health, he too was in his late 60s and not in the best physical condition. The prison sentence was effectively a death sentence of a different kind. For a man of his years, the prospect of years behind bars was not an abstraction. But the law is not in the business of mercy for organized crime leaders. He went to prison. The cascade of convictions that swept through the Kansas City crime family in the mid-1980s did something that decades of law enforcement pressure had not been able to do. It broke the organization's ability to function as a coherent enterprise. The leadership was gone. Nick Civella dead. Corki Civella imprisoned. The key operational figures who had run the Las Vegas connection were imprisoned or disgraced. The financial streams that had sustained the organization, most importantly, the Las Vegas skim, had been shut down. The regulatory environment in Nevada had changed dramatically. The Nevada Gaming Commission had tightened its oversight, established better procedures for detecting skimming, and was actively working to push organized crime out of casino ownership. The Kansas City crime family was not dead. Not yet. Organizations of that kind, built over decades and embedded in the social and economic fabric of a city, do not simply cease to exist when their leaders go to prison. The criminal culture persists. The relationships persist. The network of associates and semi-legitimate businesses that the mob had built over generations persists. But the era of national power, the era when Kansas City bosses sat at the table with New York and Chicago and discussed their Las Vegas operations in terms of millions of dollars and nationwide political influence, that era was definitively over. The mid-1980s also saw the effective end of organized crime's control over the Las Vegas casino industry. This was not entirely the result of the Strawman prosecutions, though those certainly played a major role. It was also the result of broader changes in the Nevada regulatory environment and in the economics of the casino industry itself. The Nevada Gaming Commission had spent years, with increasing rigor, investigating the backgrounds of casino owners and key employees. The process of licensing had become more demanding, more thorough, more resistant to the kind of friendly influence that had allowed mob front men to obtain licenses in earlier decades. Key mob-connected figures were found unsuitable for licensing and forced out of the industry, and the economics were changing too. The era of the single-owner casino, the Bugsy Siegels, and the Alan Glicks, and the Frank Lefty Rosenthals was giving way to the era of corporate ownership. Large public companies with stockholders and seek oversight and external auditing were acquiring casino properties and bringing professional management and genuine financial transparency to operations that had previously been opaque by design. The Stardust itself, the crown jewel of the Kansas City mob's Las Vegas empire, was eventually sold and passed through several hands before ultimately being demolished in 2007 to make way for a new development. The building came down in a planned implosion. A great tower of neon and nostalgia, collapsing in a cloud of dust, it drifted over the strip and then dissipated into the desert air. It was, in its way, a fitting metaphor, while the Strawman prosecutions were devastating the organization's upper leadership. There were also significant internal tensions within what remained of the Kansas City family. Any criminal organization facing the kind of legal pressure that Kansas City experienced in the mid-1980s inevitably faces questions of succession and loyalty that become difficult to resolve when the traditional mechanisms of authority have been disrupted. When the boss is dead and his brother is in prison and half the organization's key figures are either imprisoned or under indictment, the question of who is actually in charge and who has the legitimate authority to make decisions becomes genuinely contested. There were younger members and associates of the Kansas City organization who saw the disruption of the traditional leadership as an opportunity, an opening to move into positions of influence that they would not have been able to claim when Nick Civella was alive and in command. Some of these ambitions were relatively controlled and organizational. Others were more troubling. The period from roughly 1983 to 1989 was one of genuine fragmentation in the Kansas City family. Without the clear, respected, feared authority that Nick Civella had represented, the organization was unable to maintain the kind of discipline and coherence that had characterized it during his reign. There were disputes over money, over who controlled what gambling operations, who had the right to collect from which bookmakers, who could authorize which loans. There were disputes over authority, over who could make decisions in the absence of recognized leadership. There were disputes that escalated beyond disagreement into violence, including several murders of organization figures during this period. Each act of internal violence was, in addition to its immediate human consequences, another piece of evidence for federal prosecutors. One figure who attempted to step into the leadership vacuum left by the Civella brothers' removal from the scene was a man named Anthony Civella, Nick's nephew and a member of the family both biologically and organizationally. Anthony Civella had been involved in the organization's operations and attempted to assert a claim to leadership based on family connection and organizational standing. But Anthony Civella faced the same headwinds that had beaten down every other figure in the post-Strawman Kansas City organization. He was under law enforcement scrutiny. He was operating in an environment where the traditional revenue streams had been disrupted, where the political and police connections that had once provided protection had been largely severed, where the national underworld relationships that had given Kansas City its outsized influence were frayed or broken. He was trying to lead an army that had already lost most of its battles. The late 1980s brought additional legal pressure. Even as the Strawman convictions were working their way through the appeals process, federal prosecutors in Kansas City were bringing new cases that arose not from the Las Vegas operation, but from the organization's traditional activities in Kansas City itself. Labor racketeering charges, gambling charges, tax cases. Each new prosecution required more of the organization's shrinking resources. Each new conviction further depleted the pool of capable experienced men available to keep operations running. And there was another development that may ultimately have done more damage to the Kansas City organization than any single prosecution: the transformation of the Teamsters Central States Pension Fund. The pension fund had been, for decades, the mob's most powerful financial instrument, a pool of capital that could be directed to mob-connected borrowers, generating both financial returns and political leverage. The government's campaign against mob influence in the Teamsters, culminating in a series of prosecutions and eventually in a consent decree that placed the union under federal oversight, progressively reduced the mob's ability to direct pension fund investments. Without the pension fund as a lever, Kansas City lost one of the key tools that had given it influence in Las Vegas and beyond. It was like losing an arm. The organization could still function in a reduced way, but the strategic reach that had made it a national player was gone. The 1990s were the twilight years of the Kansas City crime family. Not the dramatic twilight of a spectacular sunset, full of color and emotion, more the quiet, gray twilight of a long afternoon fading to dusk, the gradual, unremarkable dimming of something that had once burned very bright. After the Strawman convictions and the various prosecutions of the mid to late 1980s, the Kansas City organization was a diminished entity. Its membership had been depleted by death, imprisonment, and in some cases, cooperation with federal authorities. Its financial resources were a fraction of what they had been in the Las Vegas skimming era. Its political connections, never fully recovered from the fall of the Pendergast machine, were now essentially non-existent. The men who attempted to lead the organization in these years faced an impossible task. How do you maintain a criminal enterprise when the conditions that made it viable have fundamentally changed? Corki Civella was released from prison in the early 1990s. His health severely compromised by years of incarceration. He returned to Kansas City. But he returned to a city and an organization that barely resembled what he had known when he was an active participant in its affairs. The Las Vegas connection was gone. The close relationship with Chicago, which had been the cornerstone of Kansas City's national standing, had been disrupted by the massive federal prosecution of the Chicago outfit that paralleled the Strawman prosecutions. The younger men who were now nominally running things had grown up in the organization's diminished state and lacked the experience and the connections of the generation that had built it. Corki Civella died on December 28, 1994. He was 75 years old. With his death, the last of the men who had shaped the Kansas City crime family in its full power were gone. Through the 1990s and into the 2000s, what remained of the Kansas City organization continued to operate, but at a scale and with an influence that bore no comparison to the organization's peak years. There were still gambling operations, there were still loan sharking activities. There were still men who considered themselves members of or associated with the Kansas City family, who conducted business under its nominal umbrella and maintained some of its traditional practices. But it was an organization in name more than in substance. The federal prosecution that had dismantled the Civella-era leadership had been thorough, enough that rebuilding the kind of sophisticated, nationally connected enterprise that Nick Civella had run was simply beyond the capacity of whoever remained. The men with the skills, the connections, the experience, and the vision to run a major organized crime family were either dead, imprisoned, or had been so thoroughly identified and surveilled by law enforcement that any attempt to operate at scale was immediately visible. Law enforcement in Kansas City continued to monitor whatever remained of the family, but the resources devoted to organized crime, investigation that had been concentrated on Kansas City in the late 1970s and 1980s were gradually redirected. As the threat that the organization had once represented diminished, there were periodic arrests and prosecutions through the 1990s and 2000s, cases involving gambling, fraud, and other criminal activities by individuals associated with the old organization or its remnants. These cases confirmed that organized criminal activity in Kansas City had not entirely ceased, but they also confirmed that it had been reduced to something qualitatively different from what it had once been. Not a coherent, disciplined, hierarchical organization with national connections and a sophisticated Las Vegas operation, but a scattered collection of criminal associations conducting business at a purely local level. The Italian-American organized crime family that John Lazia had built and Nick Civella had perfected had, by the turn of the 21st century, effectively ceased to function as a meaningful criminal enterprise. It was not the dramatic ending that the movies might lead you to expect. There was no final shootout, no climactic confrontation, no last stand. It ended the way most things end, gradually, through the accumulation of losses and reversals, and the passage of time. Let us now step back from this specific narrative and think about what the Kansas City crime family story actually means, what it tells us about organized crime, about American cities, about the relationship between criminal enterprise and legitimate society. The first thing it tells us is that organized crime is not a foreign import. It is not something that immigrants brought to America and inflicted on an otherwise wholesome society. The Kansas City mob was made in Kansas City, built from the raw materials of poverty, ethnic tension, political corruption, and economic opportunity that were as American as anything in the country's history. The Italian-American families who formed its core brought certain cultural traditions from their homeland. The tradition of omerta, the secrecy and silence. The tradition of clan loyalty. The tradition of the strong man who protects his community in exchange for its support. But the organizational structure, the political alliances, the specific criminal enterprises, all of that was shaped by American conditions, American opportunities, American failures of governance and law enforcement. Tom Pendergast's machine created the conditions in which organized crime could flourish, not because Pendergast was personally evil. He was, by many accounts, a man who genuinely believed he was serving his community, but because the system of patronage and corruption that he built created the structural conditions that organized crime needed to establish itself. The friendly police commissioners and the look-the-other-way prosecutors and the adjusted election returns were not just political corruption. They were the scaffolding on which the mob built its house. When the scaffolding fell, when Pendergast went to prison, when the political machine was broken, when the clean government advocates and the federal investigators began to actually enforce the law, the mob had to find new ways to protect itself. And it found them. It found them in labor unions, in Las Vegas casinos, in the sophisticated use of legal front men and financial structures that gave the organization the appearance of legitimacy. This capacity for adaptation is the second thing the Kansas City story tells us. Organized crime is remarkably adaptive. It responds to legal and social changes by finding new methods, new territories, new opportunities. The transition from Prohibition-era bootlegging to post-war gambling to Las Vegas skimming operations was not a single plan that somebody drew up in advance. It was a series of adaptations, of responses to changing conditions, of entrepreneurial opportunism on the part of criminal leaders who were, whatever their other failings, genuinely intelligent and capable administrators. Nick Civella's genius, if genius is not too strong a word for it, was precisely this capacity for adaptation. He understood that the old model of open political protection was finished. He understood that the new model required sophistication, discipline, and the kind of careful financial structuring that would make mob interests invisible in the legal economy. He built an organization suited to that new model. He also built an organization that, ultimately, could not survive the technological and legal changes that the federal government brought to bear in the 1970s and 1980s. The electronic surveillance capabilities that the FBI deployed against the Kansas City organization in the Operation Strawman investigation were simply beyond his ability to counter. He could instruct his men to be careful on the phone. He could conduct meetings in person rather than by telephone. But he could not prevent the FBI from placing microphones in the rooms where those meetings took place. The third thing the Kansas City story tells us is about the human cost of the underworld, a cost that is easy to overlook when you're telling the story in the cinematic terms it deserves. With all its atmosphere and drama and character, the human cost is real, and it is large. It includes, most obviously, the victims of the organization's violence, the men who were killed by Kansas City crime figures over the decades, the victims of the organization's loan sharks, The workers whose unions were corrupted and whose pension funds were looted. The Teamsters Central States Pension Fund, which the mob directed into mob-connected investments and drained through various schemes, was supposed to provide retirement security to hundreds of thousands of working people. The money the mob extracted from it came directly from those workers' retirement savings. The human cost includes the criminal justice system's investment in pursuing these cases, the decades of FBI investigation, the trials, the prison resources, and it includes something harder to quantify, but very real: the impact on the legitimate civic life of Kansas City. A city where organized crime has deep roots in the political structure is a city where resources are misallocated, where merit is not rewarded, where honest businesses compete on an uneven playing field against competitors who have the mob's backing. The corruption that organized crime requires and perpetuates does real damage to the communities it inhabits. Now, let us spend some time with some of the specific human details of this story, the moments and people that bring it to life beyond the organizational chart. Think about Nick Civella in the late 1970s. As the FBI's noose was tightening, he was in his mid-60s, a man who had spent literally his entire adult life navigating the particular minefield of organized crime leadership in America. Always careful, always controlled, always aware of the watchers. And now the watchers were inside the rooms where he met. They were inside the conversations he had thought were private. How does a man like that feel in that moment? Not panic. Nick Civella was not a man who panicked, but something harder than panic, perhaps. The cold recognition that the thing you had worked your whole life to build might not survive. The knowledge that the careful, patient construction of decades, the relationships, the systems, the organizational architecture was now exposed in a way that might prove fatal. He fought it. He retained lawyers. He challenged the surveillance authorizations. He maintained, for as long as he possibly could, the discipline and the silence that had protected him for so many years. Even at trial, even in his final years, Nick Civella did not become a cooperating witness. He did not trade stories about his colleagues for a reduced sentence. Whatever else he was, he held to the code of silence that was the organized crime world's most fundamental rule. There is something almost tragic about that. The intelligence and the discipline deployed in the service of something that, from the outside, was clearly wrong, clearly harmful, clearly destined to be judged by history in the harshest terms. A man of Nick Civella's capabilities, had he applied them differently, might have built something legitimate and lasting. Instead, he built an empire of criminal activity that ultimately consumed itself and those closest to him. Think about Carl DeLuna, Tuffy, sitting in a room listening to federal prosecutors play recordings of his own voice, discussing the mechanics of a multi-million-dollar criminal scheme. A man who had spent his life working carefully, operating precisely, maintaining the kind of discretion that the organization demanded, hearing himself on tape, knowing that the careful, private work of decades was now public, documented, admissible. Think about the couriers, the men who drove the skim money from Las Vegas to Kansas City, crossing the desert, and then the mountains, and then the plains with suitcases or bags or other containers, holding hundreds of thousands of dollars in cash. Ordinary-seeming men doing a very specific and very dangerous job. How many times did they drive that route? What did they think about as they crossed the Nevada border, as they passed through Utah, as they drove across Kansas toward home? Did it feel routine after a while? Or did the weight of what they were carrying never quite become ordinary? Think about Frank "Lefty" Rosenthal, the Chicago-connected casino operator who ran the Stardust for the mob. The man who is fictionally portrayed in the movie Casino, sitting in his Las Vegas office and managing an enormous, glamorous casino enterprise, while knowing that its real purpose was to funnel money to criminal organizations in 4 Midwestern cities. He was a gambling genius. He understood the casino business better than almost anyone in Nevada. And he was, in the language of the FBI, a principal figure in one of the largest financial crimes in American history. Rosenthal himself was never convicted of a crime related to the Las Vegas operation, largely because the evidence against him, while substantial in the FBI's files, was not packaged in a way that led to prosecution. But he was ultimately forced out of Nevada by gaming regulators, who found him unsuitable for licensing, and he spent the rest of his life essentially in exile from the industry he had dominated. Let us talk about one specific episode that illuminates the entire story in Microcosm. In 1975, a man named Jay Vandermark disappeared. Vandermark was a slot machine employee at the Stardust, one of the men involved in the practical mechanics of removing cash from the slot machines before it reached the official count. He had participated in the skimming operation, and by the mid-1970s had become a potential liability, someone who knew too much, and who had, by some accounts, been stealing not just for the organization, but for himself. When Vandermark disappeared, the organized crime world did not mourn. His disappearance sent a very clear message to everyone else involved in the operation about the consequences of disloyalty or independent enterprise. It was the kind of message that doesn't require words, that doesn't require explanation, that communicates itself with absolute clarity through the simple fact of a man's absence. His body was never found. This is the shadow side of the casino glamour, the violence, or the threat of it that sustained the entire operation. Not constant, not theatrical, not the way the movies sometimes portray it, but real, always present as a possibility. The implicit understanding that the men who ran this operation took it seriously, that they protected it seriously, that they dealt with threats to it seriously. The millions of dollars flowing from those Las Vegas counting rooms to Kansas City and Chicago and Cleveland were sustained, ultimately, by this kind of violence or the credible threat of it. You cannot understand the money without understanding the violence. You cannot understand the organization without understanding that at its foundation, beneath all the political sophistication and the legal front men and the financial structures, was the willingness to harm people who got in the way. Operation Strawman did not just prosecute Kansas City and its partners. It reverberated through the entire national organized crime network. The parallel prosecutions in Chicago, Cleveland, and Milwaukee produced convictions against key figures in all four cities. The Chicago outfit, which had been the most powerful organized crime organization in the Midwest for generations, saw its leadership decimated by the Strawman prosecutions and by parallel investigations. Joey Aiuppa, the Chicago boss, was convicted. Jackie Chironi, the underboss, was convicted. Angelo LaPietra, a key Chicago capo, was convicted. In Milwaukee, boss Frank Balistrieri was convicted. In Cleveland, Angelo Leonardo, the boss, became one of the most significant mob turncoats in American history, cooperating with federal prosecutors and providing testimony that filled in gaps in the government's case that surveillance alone could not have covered. Leonardo's cooperation was a watershed moment. He was a boss, not a soldier or an associate, not a peripheral figure, but one of the most senior figures in American organized crime. His decision to cooperate shattered one of the most fundamental pillars of the mob world, the idea that the code of silence was absolute, that bosses did not talk, that the organization could trust its own leadership not to betray it. If a boss could cooperate, anyone could cooperate. This realization, spreading through the remnants of organized crime families across the Midwest and beyond, accelerated the demoralization and fragmentation that was already well advanced by the mid-1980s. Let us think about the community that organized crime inhabited in Kansas City, the North Side neighborhoods, the Italian-American enclave that had been the foundation of the organization from the beginning. By the 1990s, those neighborhoods had changed enormously. The tight-knit Italian-American community that had sustained the mob through its decades of power had dispersed, moved to suburbs, intermarried, assimilated into the broader American middle class. The social conditions that had made the mob's form of community patronage valuable, the isolation, the language barriers, the mistrust of outside institutions, had largely dissolved. The mob had always depended, at least partly, on the loyalty and silence of the community it came from. When Lazia had helped a family pay their rent or interceded with the police on behalf of a neighborhood kid, he was building a social contract, an exchange of patronage for loyalty. But by the time that community no longer needed the mob's patronage, no longer relied on it for access to resources and protection, the social contract dissolved. The mob became, in the eyes of most Italian Americans in Kansas City and across the country, not a source of community protection, but an embarrassment, a legacy of the old country's dark traditions, a distortion of the immigrant experience that had been used to stigmatize an entire ethnic group. The legitimate Italian-American community did not mourn the fall of the Kansas City crime family. They had not been waiting for it to happen. But when it did, there was no grief. There was for many relief. Now we should talk about what actually remains. The Kansas City crime family exists in the strict organizational sense as at best a minor criminal operation with none of the reach, resources, or national connections of its predecessor. Law enforcement in Kansas City still occasionally identifies individuals with connections to the old organization, still monitors activity in areas where mob-associated businesses have historically operated, still traces the genealogy of criminal relationships that link contemporary figures to the organizational structures of the past. But the entity they are watching is a ghost of what it was. There are no Las Vegas connections. There are no Teamsters pension fund operations. There is no commission representation. There is no network of political protection. No friendly police commissioners. No cooperative prosecutors. There is no organization capable of generating the kind of discipline, coordinated criminal activity that characterized the family in its prime. What remains are individuals, some of them descendants of mob figures, some of them old men who were associated with the organization in their youth, some of them third-generation criminals who know the family's history as a kind of mythology. They may conduct gambling operations, engage in fraud, participate in various local criminal enterprises, but they do so without the organizational apparatus that once gave Kansas City organized crime its power. The Stardust is gone, demolished in 2007. The Fremont still stands in downtown Las Vegas, but under legitimate corporate ownership with none of the mob connections of its past. The hacienda was demolished in 1996, replaced by a new development. The counting rooms where the skim was taken have been rebuilt, monitored, regulated beyond anything that would have been recognizable to the men who exploited them. The old North Side neighborhoods of Kansas City have changed. The descendants of the Italian-American families who built the mob's social base are suburban professionals, executives, teachers, doctors, lawyers, people for whom the world their grandparents inhabited is history rather than reality. The Pendergast machine is long gone. The Union Station massacre is now a museum exhibit. The First District Democratic Club, where Charles Binagio was murdered, is a memory. Time moves on. But before we conclude, we should spend some time with two figures whose stories illuminate the human dimension of this history in particular ways. The first is Nick Civella's legacy. Considered honestly, Nick Civella was, by any objective measure, a criminal. He participated in gambling, loan sharking, labor racketeering, and the Las Vegas skimming operation, crimes that caused real harm to real people. He led an organization that was, at its core, maintained by the threat and sometimes the reality of violence. He profited enormously from the exploitation of legal vulnerabilities and political corruption. And yet, there is a complexity to the man that history demands we acknowledge. He was, by the accounts of those who dealt with him on both sides of the law, a man of intelligence and discipline, and a certain dark integrity. He kept his word. He ran his organization with a genuine commitment to the rules, his rules. To be sure, rules that served his interests and the interests of his organization, but rules nonetheless. He was not a sadist. He did not kill for pleasure. He used violence as a tool, sparingly by mob standards, and always with a calculation of necessity. He was a man who was shaped by his time and his world into something that was, ultimately, a product of American conditions as much as of personal choice. Born in a different year, in a different neighborhood, with access to different opportunities, what might Nick Civella have built? What legitimate organization might have benefited from his gifts for leadership, for patience, for strategic thinking? We will never know. History is not interested in alternate versions of itself. The second figure whose story deserves reflection is someone who is in many ways the most important character in the entire narrative. The unknown FBI agent. Not any particular agent, though there were many particular agents, working Kansas City and Las Vegas and Chicago and Cleveland, whose work over decades produced the evidence that brought the Strawman prosecutions to their successful conclusions. But the collective figure of the federal investigator, the man or woman who shows up at the office at 7 in the morning and stays until 9 at night, compiling records, reviewing surveillance transcripts, building a case one document at a time over months and years, who carries out court-authorized searches and installations with meticulous care for procedural correctness, because any mistake would invalidate years of work, who interviews witnesses and manages informants and writes reports that will eventually be read by prosecutors and judges. These people do not have the dramatic story of the mob bosses. They do not have the atmosphere, the power, the cinematic gravity of the men they pursue. Their story is the story of procedure and patience and careful, sustained work. But they won. Against one of the most sophisticated criminal organizations in American history, operating at the height of its national power and at the peak of its financial sophistication, the investigators won. The Kansas City crime family, the organization that had survived Prohibition and the fall of the Pendergast machine and the cadaver hearings and decades of federal scrutiny, did not survive Operation Strawman. The law, patiently applied, ultimately prevailed. Organized crime in America is a subject that the culture has returned to over and over again, in movies, in books, in long-form journalism, in television dramas, in podcasts, in true crime narrations like this one, The Godfather and Goodfellas, and The Sopranos, and 100 other works of art, have shaped the way that Americans think about the mob, giving it a mythology that is somewhere between history and fiction. The Kansas City story does not fit neatly into that mythology. It is not the Corleone family, no family of Sicilian nobility playing out an American tragedy of violence and assimilation. It is not the gritty street savagery of the New York families. It is something more specifically American, more specifically Midwestern, more specifically rooted in a particular combination of immigrant, ambition and political corruption and economic opportunity that characterized the American heartland in the early 20th century. What the Kansas City story tells us, ultimately, is about the relationship between criminal enterprise and legitimate institutions. Organized crime never operates in a vacuum. It operates in the spaces created by institutional failure, by political corruption, by inadequate law enforcement, by economic systems that leave some communities without legitimate opportunities. Remove the Pendergast machine and the Kansas City mob might not have established itself as powerfully as it did. Maintain honest, rigorous casino regulation in Nevada from the beginning, and the Las Vegas skimming operation never gets off the ground. The mob is a parasite, but parasites require a host. The lesson, if there is a lesson, and stories this complex don't always resolve neatly into lessons. is about the importance of the institutions that the mob exploited and corrupted. Clean government, honest law enforcement, rigorous financial regulation. These things are not interesting. They do not make for dramatic stories, but they are the infrastructure of a society that makes it harder for the parasites to find purchase. The federal government's campaign against organized crime. From the creation of the FBI's organized crime program in the late 1950s through the RICO prosecutions of the 1980s, was not perfect. It was sometimes heavy-handed. It sometimes targeted figures who were peripheral, while the real leaders evaded justice for years. But it worked. It actually genuinely worked. The major organized crime families in America are shadows of what they once were, not because they ran out of criminal ambition, but because the institutional response to them improved enough to make the old model unworkable. That is worth acknowledging. That is worth honoring. Even in a story that is fundamentally about the criminals rather than about the investigators, there is one more thing worth saying. Before we step back entirely from this story, Kansas City is a magnificent city. It is a city of extraordinary jazz history. Charlie Parker was born there. And the jazz tradition at Kansas City, developed in the 1930s, was one of the great creative flowering of American music. It is a city of beautiful architecture, the boulevards and fountains and parkways that were laid out in the grand civic style of the early 20th century give it a physical character. That is unlike almost any other American city. It is a city of passionate sports fans, of great barbecue, of the broad, flat, endlessly surprising beauty of the Missouri landscape. The mob was part of Kansas City's history. It shaped the city in ways that are still visible in certain buildings, in certain political traditions, in certain cultural memories. But it was never the most important part of the story. The most important parts of Kansas City's story are the music and the architecture, and the civic life and the generations of people, Italian American and African American and Irish American and every other kind of American who built their lives there. The mob is a chapter in Kansas City's story, but Kansas City is much larger than the mob. And so we arrive, at last, at the end of this long story. We have traveled from the bootlegging operations of the 1920s to the Las Vegas counting rooms of the 1970s. We have met John Lazia, who built the first structure of organized crime power in Kansas City and died for it at 37. We have met Charles Binagio, who reached too far for political power and paid with his life in the back room of a Democratic Party club. We have met Nick Civella, the most gifted and dangerous figure in the organization's history, patient, precise, brilliant in his way, and ultimately unable to build something that would outlast him. We have met the investigators and the prosecutors whose years of patient, careful work brought the organization down. We have stood in the counting rooms where the skim was taken, and on the streets of Kansas City's north side, where the organization had its roots. We have watched the Las Vegas empire rise and fall. We have watched an organization born in the chaos and opportunity of Prohibition, mature through the post-war years into a sophisticated national player. And then we have watched that player, like so many others, in so many places, in so many times, ultimately be brought to account. The story is over. The lights are lower now. The city is quiet. Somewhere in Kansas City, on a cold November night, the streets that once carried the long black cars of the Civella era are empty and still. The buildings where the decisions were made stand or have been replaced by other buildings. The men who made those decisions are gone, but the story remains. It always remains. And there we are. The full rise and fall of the Kansas City crime family, from John Lazia in the Prohibition-era bootlegging trade, through Nick Civella's extraordinary reign as one of America's most sophisticated crime bosses, through the Las Vegas years and the Operation Strawman prosecutions, to the quiet gray twilight of an organization that is now a ghost. If you stayed with this story until the very end, thank you genuinely. You have no idea how much it means to know that you're out there, in the middle of the night, wrapped up in a blanket somewhere, listening to these stories with the same love and care that I tried to put into telling them. Please drop a comment and tell me your favorite part of tonight's story. Was it John Lazia building the mob from nothing in the Prohibition years? Was it the Las Vegas, the glittering, audacious machinery of the skim? Was it Nick Civella himself, that extraordinary, cold, brilliant, complicated man? I read every comment. Tell me what got to you. And if this story gave you something, if it kept you company tonight, if it took you somewhere interesting, if it made the hours a little more bearable, please hit the like button. Subscribe if you haven't already, and share this with a friend who loves true crime. That simple act genuinely helps this channel reach more people and makes it possible for me to keep making stories like this one. Next time, we go somewhere even darker. I can't tell you where yet, but I can tell you this. It involves a city, a secret, a betrayal, and a name that most people have never heard. A name that, once you know it, you will never forget. Until then, rest well, the night is long, and you are safe. And the stories will always be here waiting for you. Good night.